Hello everyone and welcome to the Ticker.com's news channel on YouTube. On this channel, we review stock markets and discuss financial news, market trends, and economic data from Wall Street to Global Street. So let's dive in. We begin our review of global economy with key releases in the US, Europe, China, India, and Japan. U.S. stock market indices struggled to advance in the week as investors reviewed consumer price inflation and producer price inflation reports. Two inflation reports clearly confirm that prices are still rising faster than anticipated by the Federal Reserve, and it may take a lot longer than anticipated by policymakers to bring down inflation to 2%. Moreover, the U.S. retail sales rebounded less than expected in February, suggesting consumers are still avoiding discretionary items and sticking to the basics. These reports followed two job market reports released last week, which suggested that labor market conditions are moderating, but payrolls are still expanding at a healthy pace. In summary, investors will have to decide if current economic conditions are conducive to corporate earnings growth, and if they are, market indices are likely to go higher, even if the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates at an elevated pace for a while. Despite interest rates uncertainties in the Eurozone, market indices in France and in Germany soared to new record intraday highs. In Europe, Germany, France, and Spain reported a steady decline in inflation in February and extended drops to multi-month lows. Spain's inflation rate dropped to a 6-month low. Germany's rate fell to the level last seen in June 2021, and French inflation eased to a 27-month low. Industrial production in the Eurozone dropped at the sharpest pace in months in February after large capital goods orders plunged. In the UK, wage growth slowed in the 3-month period to January, and the jobless rate edged slightly higher to 3.9%. But the UK labor market is facing challenges because of severe long-term sickness among its population, and the share of inactive people, those neither employed nor looking for work between the ages of 16 and 64, increased to 2.7 million or 21.8% of the population. In Asia, economic data from China also took center stage. China's inflation data also suggested that policymakers are struggling to devise a response amid weak consumer demand, falling home prices, and a fragile economic recovery. In Japan, the annual wage negotiations between labor unions and large corporations resulted in the largest wage gains in more than 3 decades. Corporations agreed to wage gains of more than 5%, the second solid annual wage increase in a row, as companies struggle with labor shortages. Investors are hoping that wage inflation may finally spur the Bank of Japan to end its negative interest rate policy as early as next week. India's inflation was stable but stayed elevated, and the comments from the Securities Regulatory Agency's chief put a sharper focus on frothy conditions in small and mid-cap stocks. Let us review key events in global bond, currency, and commodity markets last week. The yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury rebounded 22 basis points to 4.30%, ahead of the Fed's rate decision next week, after two harder-than-expected inflation measures dashed hopes of a rate cut. Crude oil price increased to $81 a barrel on the strong U.S. demand and the expectations of rising global demand for the rest of the year. TTF natural gas prices hovered at 27 euros per megawatt hour, and traders weighed stable supplies from Norway and elevated storage levels in Europe against the rising demand in Asia. The euro hovered at $1.09 after the latest U.S. inflation reports dashed hopes of a rate cut. Dovish stances by policymakers in Europe contributed to the U.S. dollar's strength. The yen rebounded to 148 against the U.S. dollar after annual spring wage negotiations resulted in the largest gains in 3 decades, supporting expectations that the Bank of Japan may end its negative rate policy at the end of meeting next week. We now review the key developments in financial markets around the world last week. The S&P 500 index and the Nasdaq Composite extended weekly losses to a second consecutive week after hard inflation reports suggested that interest rates are likely to stay higher for longer. European markets extended weekly gains, and benchmark indices in Japan and France jumped to a new record intraday highs after inflation in February eased in France, Spain, and Germany. The Nikkei 225 decreased a fraction amid caution ahead of the Bank of Japan's rate decision next week. China's stock markets rebounded after bargain hunters returned and China-controlled funds stepped up market interventions amid worries of deflation, fragile economic recovery, and a persistent decline in home prices. Indian market indices declined on valuation worries in the small and mid-cap segments, and stable but elevated inflation also suggested that the Reserve Bank is less likely to consider a rate cut at its next two meetings. Let us shift our attention to merger deals, market movers, and earnings update from companies last week. Adobe, the software developer, reported mixed quarterly results and issued weak outlook for the current quarter. Ulta Beauty, the cosmetic retailer, estimated a lower-than-expected full-year sales outlook. Vodafone Group, the UK-based multinational telecom company, agreed to sell Vodafone Italy to Swisscom for an enterprise value of €8 billion. Robinhood Markets, the online brokerage firm, said assets under custody increased 16% in February from the previous month. Dollar General, the deep discount retailer, reported better-than-expected holiday quarter sales and issued an earnings outlook ahead of expectations. Dick's Sporting Goods, the athletic goods retailer, posted record quarterly sales in the fiscal fourth quarter, and Cavis soared 25% after the U.S.-based private equity firm KKR launched €2.8 billion takeover offer for the German independent power generator. Hapag-Lloyd, the Germany-based container shipping company, issued an earnings warning for the current year. EasyJet, the discount airline, completed the sale of €850 million secured bond maturing in 2031 with an interest coupon of 3.75%. Tata Motor, the India and the UK-based vehicle maker, signed a preliminary agreement with the Tamil Nadu state in India to invest $1.1 billion in a vehicle manufacturing facility. Sandoz, the generic drug maker, said core net income in 2023 declined to $953 million from $1.2 billion a year ago. Oracle Corporation, the database and cloud computing company, reported better-than-expected quarterly earnings. On holdings, the Swiss shoemaker reported weaker-than-expected revenue and net income swung to a loss. Southwest Airlines, the regional airline, said it plans to reduce its capacity and re-evaluates its 2024 financial projections in light of persistent delays in aircraft deliveries from its sole supplier Boeing. 3M Company, the diversified conglomerate, revised its earnings per share outlook and appointed a new chief executive officer. Next week in the U.S., investors are looking ahead to the Federal Reserve's monetary policy decisions and economic projections, including interest rate outlook. In addition, investors are looking forward to the release of housing starts, completions, building permits, and existing home sales data. In the UK, the Bank of England is expected to keep its benchmark rate steady at 5.25%, and consumer price inflation is expected to edge higher by 0.7% in February. Central banks in Norway, Turkey, Switzerland are also expected to keep their interest rates steady. In Japan, the Bank of Japan is likely to announce its plans to end the negative interest rate regime, and investors are awaiting the release of inflation, industrial production, and international trade data. In China, the central bank is expected to hold 1- and 5-year interest rate steady, and investors are looking ahead to the release of retail sales, industrial production, and fixed asset investment data. You can review daily U.S. and global financial markets news, stock movers, earnings releases, SEC filings, and economic updates on ticker.com and 123jump.com. You can find the latest financial books on redera.com, keep up with financial industry events on eventsinamerica.com, and review ETF and mutual fund performance and in-depth profiles on tickerfunds.com, and review market updates and stock movers in India on niveshak.in. That's all for today, and we will see you next week.